Thank you, Mr. President. I believe I have 20 to 30 minutes. I would appreciate if you would let me know when I've consumed 15 minutes.
Senator will be so notified.
I come to the floor. I've been in the Congress for a lot of farm bills. Seen a lot of things tried. Saw freedom to farm. Saw the last farm bill. Saw the one before that. And I'm looking at this one. And it reminds me of the commercial, the auto commercial, something's up, something's up. Well, it sure is. Only in Washington can we claim a bill saves $24 billion when it increases the spending 43% over the next 10 years. How's that fit? Is that just the language of Washington? In fact, we're going to spend almost $1 trillion over the next 10 years on what should be called a food security bill rather than a farm bill, because this isn't a farm bill, this is a food security bill. And the language that we hear from our colleagues is totally parochial or product-based. And we hear all the claims that we're thinking about the best interests of the nation. What we're really thinking about is the best interests of the parochial values from our own states. And that's how you get this conflagration of people coming together to pass a bill that, I admit, has some limited reforms in it. But I just heard the senator from North Dakota talk about how we create wealth. I couldn't disagree more. We create wealth by making sure the risk of capital investment are responsive to market forces. This farm bill is anything but that. There's no response to market forces because there's no place else in this country where you can go into a business or an enterprise and being guaranteed that your revenue is going to be secure. We've even added a new supplemental low-cost crop insurance program that all of us who aren't farmers in America are going to pay the deductible on. Plus, we're going to subsidize 62 to 63% of all the crop insurance in the country. So when we subsidize crop insurance, what we're doing is we're taking the capital risk, we're modifying the risk, and so therefore markets aren't going to work. And so we talk about sugar prices. Americans are losing candy manufacturers like crazy. Why is that? Because Americans pay twice as much as the rest of the world for sugar. Because we're protecting cane sugar and beet sugar farmers rather than let market forces work. I'm really disturbed at the process of this bill as well. Senator Durbin and I tried to put some income limitations on the benefits to the wealthiest in this country when it comes to crop insurance. It passed this Senate with 64, 65 votes. It was in the bill when it left here. The House passed the same thing by a voice vote, and the conferees took it out. What's the Farm Bill really about? It's about protecting the well-heeled and the well-connected in the agricultural community. I know a little bit about agriculture. My dad ran a ranch with 5,000 mother cows. I worked on it summer and after schools. Back then, in the 70s, there were no benefits for a cattle rancher. That's all come into the farm programs since the 70s, guaranteeing them that now they'll make decisions that are against market forces, but will farm the government. So I'd say again, only in Washington, when we're going to spend $350 billion more on a program over the next 10 years, will somebody claim that we're cutting spending $14 to $20 billion. Only in Washington will that happen. It's unique Washington accounting. And we've heard all the proponents say what a great job they did. Well, let me talk a little bit about some of the details of this farm bill. You know, one of the things the president talked about, he just put Joe Biden in charge of job training program, looking at all of them, seeing if they have metrics. The GAO has studied that. I've actually looked at every job training state and federal in my state. They had 10 job training pilot programs in this bill. We don't need any more job programs. What we need to do is make sure the ones we got work and have metrics on them. Make sure that when we spend American taxpayers' dollars, that we're actually giving somebody a life skill rather than filling the coffers of the companies that contract to do all this job training programs and the small bureaucracies that suck up the grants. Because in Oklahoma, their federal programs are highly ineffective, especially when you compare them to the state-run programs, which are highly effective. So in this farm bill, we're creating more job training programs. Sounds good. It's a good soundbite on the floor, good soundbite at home in the press. But something's up. And what is up is we continue to make the same mistakes as the legislative body. And that mistake is we want to please constituents at home more than we want to fix the real problems in front of this nation. Let me talk about the SNAP program for a minute. There's not anybody in this country that I want to go hungry. But when this country was first founded, we used some very good principles that the Senate and the House have totally disregarded in terms of how you help people. And I referenced the historical blueprint on this from a book that was written by a man by the name of Marvin Olasky. And the title of that book was called The Tragedy of American Compassion. How did we used to help people versus how are we helping them now? How did we build up people as we helped them versus now how are we tearing down people as we help them? Creating dependency versus creating responsibility. And he outlined several factors that this country has used in the past that we ought to be re-embracing. And let me just list a couple of them. One is we should give relief to people only after one-on-one personal investigation of their need. Let me say that again. We ought to know they need it. Because contrast where the money's coming from. The money's not coming from today's taxpayer when we're running a $640 billion deficit. The money's coming from our kids and our grandkids. And do we not have an obligation to know that when we give somebody a SNAP card, that they really need it? Versus the fact that the SNAP cards get sold, the PIN number gets sold, and the SNAP card's used by somebody else, and I take my cash. It's going on all throughout this country. And that's not to say that most of the people who are getting this benefit don't need it. But because there's no personal investigation into it, no accountability on the part of the receiver or the giver, we're creating a situation in our country where we're undermining self-reliance. The second point he made was to give necessary articles and only what is immediately necessary. That means you have to investigate it. To give what is least susceptible to abuse. To give only in small quantities and in proportion to immediate needs, and less than might be procured by labor, except in cases of sickness. That's a great principle. Let's help people, but let's help people help themselves. And let's don't create a situation of temptation to do the wrong thing. To give assistance at the right moment, not to prolong it beyond duration of the necessity which calls for it. We don't do that at all in any of our programs. To require of each beneficiary absence from intoxicating liquors and drugs. To discontinue relieving all who manifest a purpose to depend on alms rather than support their own exertions for support. I don't have one problem paying my taxes to make sure people don't go hungry
start with that then.
and that have food on the table for their kids. You know, I just watched a video my daughter had referred to me, and it's a documentary. And I have to say, as a physician, understanding the scientific tests and the great research that was in this, it's called Forks Over Knives. And it makes the case that most of our healthcare costs are based on our diet. And it's very, very accurate and very well done. Except we have no limitations. Senator Harkin and I, for years, have tried to get limitations on how food stamps and SNAP cards are used. We can't budge anybody to say that we ought to limit it to healthy foods. Because for every dollar we're spending on food, we're creating $1 in healthcare costs down the road. And I'd recommend my colleagues watch that study. It is unbelievable in terms of heart disease, diabetes, hypertension, no medicines, just change diets, and all of a sudden those things go away. They go away because we take big agribusinesses push to use what is profitable out of the food chain and then start supplying foods that actually are good for us. It seems to me that Congress looks backwards instead of forwards when it comes to the Farm Bill. One of the things we ought to do is look at the world and what the population is. I also want to say that some of the hardest working people in this country are the people who are in agriculture. I don't say these things to demean them, but markets really do work, and we really hurt our farmers when we take them away from market forces, because that will cause them to make decisions that are false choices when it comes to capital investment. And those are false choices for our country, because that means capital's going into something that's subsidized by the government rather than going into something that's not subsidized that will create a greater good and more wealth for our country. This bill does exactly that. You realize that in this bill, you're guaranteed 86% of your revenue. I mean, think about that. You know anywhere else where you can get your revenue on your crops guaranteed at 86%, and the federal taxpayers paying most of the cost of the insurance for that? Individuals in Oklahoma and Maine and Virginia are paying higher tax dollars so we can create a system where we're investing in crops, one, that aren't necessarily good for us, two, that cause us to pay a higher price for domestically produced crop versus world markets, whereas we could redirect those same inputs into a product that's much better for us and we'll be much more competitive in. One of the points I would make, in 2013, net farm income was $131 billion. That's 16.5% over what it was the year before, in an economy that's only growing less than 2%. And yet we're going to spend almost $100 billion a year in the future, of which only 15% of that, 18% of that, will be for agricultural programs outside of the food stamp program. We're going to spend $18 billion to misdirect capital in a way that in the long run we won't see that kind of growth. I'll finish up with just other commentary. That is necessary we have a farm program. But there's one little trick in this farm bill that everybody ought to be aware of. It's the pressure for the next farm bill that's put in this farm bill. And you know what it is? They didn't eliminate any of the permanent law that's on the books. They just let it stay there, and then we created a farm bill for 5 years. What's the purpose of that?
Senator has consumed 15 minutes.
Thank you. The purpose of that is so in 10 years, and in 5 years when we come to another farm bill, the default position will fall back to 40s area agricultural law, which will create pressure to do a farm bill. And if we do the same thing next time, it's going to cost $1.5 trillion over the following 10 years. My best friend is a feed corn, soybean, and wheat farmer. He farms in excess of 2,000 acres in Oklahoma. I actually, on breaks when they're harvesting, I go down and drive a grain buggy. I've only bent the auger on it once. I get to hear it from the farmer's perspective. You know what he tells me? We don't need any of this anymore. We don't need it. We need decisions on capital investment to be made on risk and markets. You can't tell me when we've got $131 billion in net farm income this year that we need to be subsidizing 86% of everybody's product, guaranteeing them no matter what happens to both yield or price, you're going to get 86%. And the American taxpayer, the cost of this bill isn't just the $1 trillion that we're talking about. It's going to be much higher. And I'll make one final point. We've had historic high commodity prices, and they've moderated somewhat. But if they go back anywhere close to historical prices, this bill is going to cost at least another $100 billion, just in one program alone. And CBO's assumption is that we're not going to do that. But most of the leading agricultural economists in this country think corn's going to be under $4. It's going to be $3.75, and that wheat will decline, and soybeans will decline. So the score you have on this bill is nonsense, because it doesn't reflect the reality of what's happening out there. I would say I appreciate the hard work that the people on the Farm Bill did. I'm highly critical of adding new job programs. I think that you've missed it completely. You don't even know what the real problem is in terms of job training in this program. And it's 10 pilot programs that aren't going to make a difference anywhere. What we ought to have is real programs that are WTO compliant, that reconnect capital investment with the real world forces of market prices and markets. You know, we spend $200 million a year just on one program, assisting farmers selling their products overseas. You know what sells products overseas? Price, quality. But we got a little $200 million program that everybody in organized agriculture gets to take advantage of. Get a couple of trips a year on the federal taxpayer. It ought not be so. If you want to promote your product, you ought to be out promoting it. We shouldn't be promoting private brands with federal government money. We ought to create the opportunity to promote it, but we shouldn't be doing it. Needless to say, I will not be voting for cloture on this, and I will reemphasize again, Senator Durbin and I had a great amendment. Those that signed the conference report that took that out can't stand up and say anything about anybody that's wealthy in this country or the tax rates or anything else, because you just gutted one of the things that would have really put back equality in terms of the farm program for the very, very wealthy in this country. We're continuing to pay hundreds of millions, if not billions, monthly to the most well-connected, well-financed, wealthiest people in this country because they're farming the farm program. And taking that out, you lose all moral authority to ever say anything again about income inequality in this country because you chose, those that signed the conference report, to take that out. So we understand how politics works. I understand how politics works. But credibility is important in our country, and we're losing it. We're losing it here. We're losing it. You just look at the polls. We've lost it in the nation's capital as far as the American people are concerned. And we haven't just lost credibility. We're losing legitimacy because we wink and nod and do the parochial vote, even though in the best long-term interests of our country, we're doing the wrong thing, but it sure sells well at home. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.